Updating tonight's top stories, Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has died. The 67-year-old former leader was shot while campaigning for upcoming parliamentary elections. A shock and dismay from world leaders who have lauded his qualities as both a man and a statesman. Japan's longest-serving Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was no stranger to politics. He had grown up in public service. His father served as foreign minister, while his grandfather was a former prime minister. So it was no surprise he would go on to be a major influence in Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party. His first term lasted only a year, from 2006 to 2007, when he stepped down due to ill health. But in his second term, the longest consecutive service for a Japanese leader lasted from 2012 to 2020. It was then he solidified his signature Abenomics, an economic policy focused on increased government spending, stimulus, and infrastructure reforms. That commitment to change went beyond the economy. Under Abe, Japan went through its most dramatic shift in its military policy in 70 years. He boosted defense spending and in 2014 allowed Japanese troops to engage in overseas combat. It was the first since World War II. Mr. Abe was also a driving force behind the 2020 Tokyo Summer Olympics. Despite public outcry and criticism over government supposedly prioritizing the event over their well-being during the pandemic, the Japanese leader never wavered in pushing to host the Games. The Olympics were postponed for a year. By then, in 2021, Mr. Abe had ended his second term. He is survived by his wife, Aki Abe. The two were married in 1987 and did not have children. And for more analysis on Mr. Abe's considerable legacy, we're joined now by Dr. Donna Weeks, Professor of Political Science at Musashino University in Tokyo. Professor Weeks, it's easy to praise a leader who has passed away, but if we look just at the facts, so between his first and second terms, you had 5 Japanese leaders, each one lasting about a year in office. Mr. Abe then returns in 2012, and then we have the longest term in office for a Japanese prime minister, 8 years. But in 2020, he stepped down, of course, again because of ill health. What qualities did he have to last those 8 years and to make a mark in those 8 years?
Yes, it's interesting those the 8 years that he was in for his second term. A lot of people have said, well, really, there were perhaps no other potential prime ministers at the time. He also had that kind of personality where he was able to change the rules surrounding the length of the prime ministerial terms in the Liberal Democratic Party. He just had that. It was a real contrast from his first term back in 2006, and I think he made the most of it and really pressed on with it. So.
Well, if we look at the ideas that Mr. Abe had in his time, we could argue they're coming to fruition in Mr. Fumio Kishida's office now. So, for example, the Quad, which was formalized under Mr. Abe, the idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy, which the original author was, in fact, Mr. Abe himself, a more muscular posture on Taiwan and defense as well. All these were authored by Mr. Abe.
This is true, and I guess his one of his key legacies too will be, I think of him as a radical conservative. His push to change and the Japanese constitution to, in fact, I guess he was asking for some legitimacy for the Japanese self-defense forces to be able to move forward and put a stronger military and defence position for Japan in the region. Now, that was quite significant. And as you say, this is right in the middle of an election campaign, and it's an upper house election. It's a half-term election. It's in a way, it's not that significant. We hadn't anticipated it would make much difference to the present Kishida government. And of course, Kishida has already announced that he intends to double the defence budget to 2%, which, having had a previous ceiling of 1%, this is changed to 2%, has been fiercely contested by the opposition leaders during these campaign speeches, which is where former Prime Minister Abe was today in one of these campaign speeches. And, we've seen the consequences, and, we're all still processing what that actually meant.
Well, what might it mean for the administration of Fumio Kishida? He's generally regarded as a protege of Mr. Shinzo Abe because he was foreign minister during Mr. Abe's time in office. Also, his policy chief in the LDP as well. But it's also known that without Mr. Abe's support, Mr. Kishida could not have won the leadership elections within the LDP. Now, with this main backer now gone, does this change at all Mr. Kishida's maybe approach to foreign policy or domestic policy? What do you think?
This will be interesting. Prime Minister Kishida spoke twice to the media today, once on hearing of the shooting initially, and again once former Prime Minister Abe's death was confirmed at 5:03. Prime Minister Kishida is interesting because he comes from Hiroshima. His political base is Hiroshima, and one of his things that he's tried to push too is, of course, an anti-nuclear weapons stance, which is kind of quite in contrast in many ways. And so he's had to walk this rather fine line between the sort of push that the former Prime Minister Abe wanted to see and the role for Japan in the region, while at the same time, Prime Minister Kishida is also trying to temper this balance with an anti-nuclear weapons policy as well. Now, what this will mean, look, I think yes, I think looking at Prime Minister Kishida this afternoon, you could see he clearly lost a very close colleague and possibly mentor of sorts. And I think it's going to take a little while for us to see where Prime Minister Kishida will come out after this.
Thanks so much for joining us. Dr. Donna Weeks, Professor of Political Science at Musashino University, speaking to us live from Tokyo.